A warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today. We're going to give others a minute or two to join, and then we will begin. So thank you. Right, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. We only have an hour today for this webinar, so let's get started. As always, we are live streaming the webinar to YouTube, so we will be able to direct folks there who've missed the beginning or missed it altogether. But I'd really like to welcome you all today to this exciting new webinar series that EPI-WIN is hosting in collaboration with a fairly new team at WHO. This team has recently been established to lead an area of work called infectious hazards foresight. So today on this webinar, you will learn what foresight is, particularly in the context of pandemic preparedness. We'll also learn about the methodologies employed and the contribution of foresight to global conversations, planning, and actions to improve pandemic preparedness. So we have three speakers with us here today. We have Dr. Sylvie Briand, the Director of the Department of Global Infectious Hazards in the Health Emergencies Program in WHO. Sylvie is no stranger to you and has appeared on many of our webinars before. It's really her vision that is leading all this work. So we're really delighted to have you here today, Sylvie. We also have with us Alexander Alexiou. Alex is a senior foresight strategist at Arup. He works with organizations across virtually every industry to identify and analyze trends, explore future possibilities, and plan scenarios that build resilience for the future. So Alex works closely with the WHO team, leading the scenario planning exercises about the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and preparedness. And of course, last but not least, we also have with us today Dr. Daniel Cortez. Dr. Cortez is a medical doctor who specialized in internal medicine and infectious diseases. Dr. Cortez has been working with the World Health Organization since 1997, most recently in the position of WHO representative in the countries of Mozambique, Thailand, and now Cabo Verde. So welcome to all our speakers and panelists today. We will have a time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So if you do have a question, please submit it in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will try to address as many of those as possible. So to start, I'd like to hand over to Sylvie.
Many thanks, Sarah, for this nice introduction. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this first EPI-WIN webinar of this series on infectious hazard foresight. And I would like to share my experience. I've been on many outbreaks response since the beginning of my career. And basically all the major threats of this century, starting with SARS in 2003, pandemic influenza in 2009, Ebola 2014, yellow fever in Angola in 2016, plague in Madagascar 2017, and now COVID-19 since 2020, early 2020. So, and every time we face a major event like that, we often do after action review and we draw the lessons from the response, and then we fix what has not worked in this outbreak. But from my experience, also I have noticed that usually the next epidemic or pandemic is completely new. It's a new animal. And we are not necessarily already prepared for it. And so I think this is why we wanted really to add to this common approach of lessons learned, this new and exciting innovative Foresight initiative, which is about imagining the future of infectious threats for the next 3 to 5 years, so that we can think out of the box. And I think out of the box is really difficult because we all have our own cognitive bias, and we tend to do more of the same usually, or maybe some course corrections sometime, but it's easier, of course, to remain in our comfort zone and to just think that if it didn't work that time, it's because we didn't do enough of it. But sometimes the solution lies somewhere else. And to find this new solution, innovative solution, we need really to also think about different scenarios for the future. So this is what Foresight is about. It's really imagining the future, imagining different scenarios, and see what would we do in this case and in this particular situation. So we think that this Foresight initiative will help us to be better prepared for the threats of the future, because we know that there will be other pandemic. We just don't know when it will happen and what kind of pathogen will be responsible of the next pandemic. And so, and there might be huge differences depending on which pathogen emerge, on how, in which kind of setting it emerges as well. So I think it's important to discuss this. So this Foresight initiative is really to facilitate first this global debate around plausible scenarios. And that we have very different perspective, whether you live in the north or in the south, or in a rich country or a poorer country. We have all different perspectives, but the pandemic is a global event, so we need to be on the same boat, on the same page as well, if we want to respond together. The second thing that is really important with this scenario building is to identify threats, opportunities, and risk, and find together also innovative solutions. We are living this pandemic in the midst of a technological revolution. We have new tools for contact tracing, for even vaccines and so on. So everything is really changing very fast. And so how can we integrate those the evolution in our planning for the next pandemic? And finally, what we want also with this approach is to shift from a reactive to a proactive approach to address infectious threats. And this is also requires, of course, some investment. And that's why I think this Foresight exercise that we will do all together is really important. So it's a series, as I said at the beginning. So today we are going to focus much more on the methods, on how we are building scenarios, and how those scenarios may differ from the global level to the country level, because at country level, of course, the other factors are playing an important role. And so this discussion will help us also to get to know each other. And I really hope that if you follow this first webinar, that you will like it, and we will continue the journey together as well until the roundtable that we will have in November as well, where other speakers will share with us their vision of the future as well. So I would like to thank really first Sarah for being our moderator today, and she's excellent in this. And so I'm really happy to answer any question you have. And over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sylvie, for the opening remarks. We're going to jump into the meat of it now, so to speak, and I'd like to invite Alexander to present. Alex is going to walk us through a little bit more about what Foresight is and the methodologies that are used in this project. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Sylvie. Can I just check that you can all see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant, thank you. Before we begin, I would also like to thank you, Sylvie and Sarah and Margot and the rest of the WHO team for organizing this series of webinars to accompany our Foresight initiative. It is a great honor to be here today, and a very warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being with us today and spending an hour with us. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Alex. I'm a senior Foresight consultant in Arab's Foresight team in London. And for the past few months, I have been working closely with Sylvie and her team in the WHO on this scenario planning exercise about the future of COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats. So for those of you who don't know Arab, we are an independent firm of designers, planners, engineers, consultants, and technical specialists, and we offer a broad range of services across the built environment, across all scales, and across all sectors of the built environment. Today, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Foresight. Sylvie's overview was already quite good, Sylvie. So I will take a step back and I will try to explain what is Foresight, why is it useful and why is it important, what are some of the methodologies and what are some of the practical uses, both within the pandemic preparedness context, but also other contexts. So in order to give you a more broad understanding of what Foresight is and what Foresight can do. So what is Foresight? When we talk about Foresight, we talk about the theory, the theoretical and the methodological part, if you like, and we like to synopsize this under the umbrella term of futures thinking. And we also talk about the practical application of Foresight. So Foresight is a set of approaches and tools which are designed to help identify trends and emerging issues, negotiate uncertainties, articulate future scenarios, develop visions of desired futures, identify opportunities for innovation, or design robust policies and strategies. So while I let you recover from this rather long definition of Foresight, I would like to highlight two key points, which are very important when someone tries to understand and define Foresight. First key point is that Foresight is not about predicting the future, right? Rather is about understanding the future. And second key point, which is very closely linked to the first key point, is that the future is not singular. There is not only one future, but there are multiple futures in the same way that there are multiple histories and multiple presents. So what Foresight essentially does, it helps us explore these alternative futures, these futures that are possible, probable, and preferable. And by doing so, it helps us understand current systems and current complexity. So contrary to what many people think about Foresight, Foresight is not only about the future, right? It looks into the future, but it builds very strong links to the present, and it also builds very strong links to the past. Elon Musk, in a TED conversation in 2017, when he was asked about the future, he gave this really good answer. So Elon Musk said that he looks at the future from the standpoint of probabilities, right? It is like the future is this branching stream of probabilities, and there are certain things that we can do to either accelerate one thing or slow down another thing, right? So, but why is this important, right? Why is it important to be able to have this overview of the future, and why is it important to be aware of the actions that you can take to affect this future? Essentially, why is Foresight important? Why is Foresight useful? And the answer is because we live in a VUCA world. We live in an extremely volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And as Sylvia already mentioned, it is not enough to react in events and developments, right? It is not enough to maintain that reactive stance. We have to be able to anticipate and expect the unexpected, and we have to be able to anticipate, manage, and embrace change. Because change in this VUCA world is constant and rapid. Just imagine or try to consider what was the impact of the technological advancements of the past 20 years on your life, and also try to imagine what the technological advancements of the next 20 to 25 years will be on your life. So while change is constant, the context that this change happens within is variable, right? So we all know that most people, most systems, most organizations, spaces, places, and infrastructure are affected by the same core megatrends, by the same trends, and by the same drivers. What is really changing and what is really different is how these trends impact someone or something, how these trends impact a specific organization, specific space, a specific place, and a specific system. This always depends on the context. And what Foresight does is really it helps us imagine and understand better that context, right? And Foresight does that through a very, very simple, seemingly process of moving from this pool of abstract evidence to something that's a bit more tangible, right? To something that's a bit more real. So what Foresight essentially does, it makes sense of all the trends and all the benchmarks and all of the observations, opinions, and expectations that are out there. And it tries through a process of conversation, prioritization, and contextualization to make this context specific, right? And it tries to translate this into something that is properly designed, some sort of policy, some sort of investment strategy or strategy overall. So what essentially what Foresight does, it helps us ask the right questions, and it helps us understand what are the things that we would like to know, what are the things that we should know, and what are the things that we have to know about the future in order to make better decisions today. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and just going back to the conversations we're having with Sylvie and her team in the WHO, these are exactly the questions that we're trying to ask and answer at the same time. If the COVID-19 pandemic and if the other infectious threats is the context that we are looking into, and it is the context that we're exploring, what are all these things that we need to know in order to be better prepared for the next 3 to 5 years? So some of the methodologies of Foresight, we like to say that Foresight is both an art and science. And there are many methodologies, and they're very well summarized in this Foresight diamond. So there are Foresight methodologies that are very creativity driven, right? And they are a bit more abstract, they're a bit more speculative, and they're a bit more imaginative. But there are also Foresight methodologies that are more evidence-driven and evidence-backed and a bit more structured. At the same time, Foresight relies heavily on interaction, right? It relies heavily on talking to people, interacting with people, conversing with people. And these interactions can either be based on a very structured expert level, so conversations with subject matter experts on a theme or on a topic, or they can be interactions with people that come from various backgrounds. And this is particularly important in this exercise that we are currently undertaking in collaboration with the WHO. These methodologies can be used independently, but where Foresight really thrives, and really flourishes is in a combination of these methodologies. So for the Infectious Hazard Foresight Initiative, we are using a number of these methodologies, and we are combining them to get the best result. So in terms of creativity-driven methodologies, we are using scenario building and scenario planning, as Sylvie already mentioned. We are coupling this with some science fiction writing because we want this to be exciting, we want this to be engaging, we want this to raise people's imagination. And at the same time, we are using very strong evidence-driven methodologies like economic modeling, literature review, and horizon scanning to really understand what are these trends that are shaping the future of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, we're conducting very, very rigorous engagement plan with a lot of people, and these webinars are part of this engagement initiative. And we are talking both with experts in the epidemiological field, right? People that really know what's going to happen or really know their stuff when it comes to the COVID-19 pathogen and host characteristics. But we are also talking to experts that come from a range of other sectors and other backgrounds to really understand all these other sectors that might not be directly relevant to COVID-19, but they revolve around COVID-19 and they have an impact on COVID-19, or COVID-19 has an impact on them. So what are the practical uses of Foresight? And apart from the very obvious, which is in the context of COVID-19 pandemic and in the context of exploring the future of other infectious threats, Foresight and its practical application is based on a trilogy of things, right? There are like 3 questions that we usually ask when we apply Foresight, right? And these 3 questions is what, so what, and now what? And this really goes back to what I described a minute ago around the process, how we go from this abstract, like fluid trend into an implication and into an action. So how do we translate Foresight thinking into an action, a set of actions, and set of strategies, a set of policies. And a good example here is aging population, right? If we take aging population as a trend, then what does this mean? What's the implication of aging population? And one could be that there might be more healthcare demand in the future. And now what do we do about that, right? What do we do about it in the future? And an answer could be we design better and more age-friendly spaces, or we provide better quality or new healthcare services. So this trilogy, it is important to keep that in mind, because it is applicable at all levels when you when it is time to apply Foresight. And these levels can vary from a region, from a country, and it can go like down to a society, to a neighborhood, to a district, even to a market or a market segment, and even a company, an organization, or even a group of people. So I thought, closing this presentation and before passing it over to Daniel, I would give you a very quick overview of some of the things that we worked in the past as a company, and just take your mind a little bit away from the COVID-19 pandemic, to give you an overview of the overall context that, and other examples that Foresight can be applied on, and then we can come back to the COVID-19 pandemic and this Foresight exercise. So we use and apply Foresight to create visions. And these visions can be visions for an island in Japan, for example, where we're really trying to identify what are the growth opportunities for the area. What are the investments that the area and the local government will do in order to make sure that the future of the island is bright, and also the future of the community is also bright and prosperous. We also apply and use Foresight to create vision for city districts. So one level down in the spatial scale, right? We help imagine what a new master plan might look like. We help imagine what a master plan must look like in order to take into account the current socioeconomic landscape of the area, but also future-proof the center of Singapore in this case for what's coming in terms of urban development and overall trends in the urban landscape. And we also use Foresight tools and methodologies to imagine how a state-of-the-art air mail distribution center in Hong Kong might look like, right? Where we utilize the latest and best trends in technology, in mail and parcel logistics to create something that's, again, ready for the future and will last longer, or it will last for the next 10, 20, 30, or even 50 years. And on a level even lower, I mean, we use Foresight to develop visions for buildings, right? So we use Foresight tools and methodologies to imagine what the future building could look like based on trends and based on changes happening now. So in this case, how does a future campus for vocational training in Hong Kong look like? At the same time, we use Foresight to identify business opportunities for organizations, right? We explore the megatrends in the transport sector, for example. We help businesses and we help organizations make informed decisions around where they should invest or where they should guide their R&D funds. The future of retail, very similar here. We help organizations imagine what the future of retail will look like, what the future of London, in this case, in the downtown London, will look like, and what they need to do in order to keep their assets up to date. And in a larger scale, we use Foresight to explore larger ecosystems like the future of healthcare, right? What is the future of healthcare? What is the future of healthcare ecosystems in the next 5, 10, 15 years? What does this mean for hospital operators? What does this mean for organizations like the WHO? What does this mean for city urban planners and engineers? How do we build hospitals of the future? And then in the same context, and a bit more relevant context, we're gradually coming back to the COVID-19 pandemic. How do we use Foresight to set some visions and to imagine how the built environment will look like beyond COVID-19, right? I mean, how will our future spaces look like? How will the future workplace look like based on the impact of the COVID-19 had on areas and sectors like remote working or transport, or blurring the boundaries between what is a home, what is a work environment, or even what is an entertainment environment. So beyond and past COVID-19, how will people live? How will they play? How will they work? And how will they experience entertainment? Again, similarly, within the COVID-19 pandemic context, how will economies look like, right? What is the socioeconomic landscape after the COVID-19 pandemic is finished or not? And on a more, let's say, long-term scale, we also use Foresight to imagine worlds that are a bit further down into the future, right? In this case, how will 2050 look like? What is the future of the world in 2050? What do we need to do today in terms of urban planning, in terms of design, in terms of the built environment to make sure that in 2050, planetary health and societal health are at the same level? And with that, I would like to leave it here and pass it on to Daniel. And thank you again very much. And I will gladly answer all your questions about not only Foresight, but how Foresight can be used within the context of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you again very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that wonderful overview. And yes, we'd now like to hand over to Daniel. So our colleague, Daniel, you're based in Cabo Verde at the moment. And while these discussions are going on at a global level, we'd really like to hear your perspective of what that means for countries and preparedness planning. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks so much, Sylvie. Great to see you again. And thanks so much to the whole team for inviting me. Alexander, that was a really fascinating presentation. So my name is Daniel Curtis. I am a WHO representative. I've been working with WHO for almost 25 years, and most of it has been at country level. I'd really like to just begin my comments with two caveats. The first is around the relevance of my comments. All of you watching, live in countries, and you all have a country perspective. You all lived this pandemic at the country level. So please, I am fully aware that every one of you has a perspective, and that my comments do not reflect the definitive country level experience, really on any subject. But also to say, the second caveat is really that this work is sort of new to me. You know, I think Alexander's presentation was the first that I've really seen this and understood it. But that having been said, I do have a couple of comments that I think might be relevant from a country perspective. And I think the first thing is really that this is really a new paradigm. In my experience, I have not been a part of or aware of this kind of systematic scenario development, foresight planning, future planning development going on at the country level. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of work going on at the country level. For instance, in Thailand, there's an extremely strong academic sector, and there was a lot of work going on to model the behavior of the pandemic when it arrived. And this contributed, no doubt in my mind, that this contributed to the effective response we saw in the initial days of Thailand. There were strong laboratory and research networks that were able to respond, and there's even legislation about what countries can do, what governments can do during pandemics and epidemics. But there isn't really sort of the kind of broader level imaginative analytics that I think Alexander is talking about, sort of analytics and foresight planning for preventive policy action. So I think there's really a huge future for this at country level. And I'm wondering, I got to thinking about why that might be, and I sort of wonder at this point whether or not this kind of thinking or this kind of exercise is really sort of feasible at this stage at country level, whether it's sort of practical. You know, most of the countries where I work, lower middle-income countries, middle-income countries, are really preoccupied with providing basic, affordable healthcare, reforming their health systems, with human resource issues, securing financing, and sustaining their health systems under significant budgetary pressure in peacetime. I think if you want to do this, this kind of planning, this kind of analytics well at country level, excuse me, you need to have the luxury of time and capacity. I think in many countries where WHO works, having time to devote to this kind of planning, to this kind of thinking for the future is a bit of a luxury. If you're going to do this, you know, who are you taking off? What work to do this? What community or what issue is not being served today as you take people and resources to plan for tomorrow? So I think we need to think about developing, providing the resources, countries with resources and capacity to do this kind of thinking. I think another challenge that countries have is sort of mustering what I think is really the kind of multi-sectoral approach that is needed to contribute to this kind of planning. I think One Health is a great platform to launch this from, and I think One Health is very well developed in many countries, including in both Thailand and here in Cabo Verde. I think it's a very good place to start. But I think many health problems currently require a multi-sector approach, and in my experience, countries have had a lot of challenges in sort of mobilizing that approach, especially for proaction. I think that countries can react in a sort of a cross-sectoral way when it comes to reaction, but I think for the kind of proaction that we're talking about, this might be a challenge. I think all countries, in my experience, are very interested in identifying what went right and what went wrong. All countries, as Sylvia alluded to at the beginning in her introduction, are interested in lessons learned. And most countries have done exercises to identify what went right and wrong, sort of interaction reviews. And many countries, including the ones where I've worked, are sort of developing sort of post-pandemic plans to address some of the lessons that are learned. But I think these recommendations tend to be very broad. Things like improving surveillance, expanding laboratory capacity, better primary health care. And I think they're a little bit different than the kind of things that we're talking about here in terms of thinking about different futures and different scenarios. I think that we may need to sort of change the way we think about applying lessons to learn to this kind of foresight planning. Sort of a little bit perhaps more strategic in developing recommendations and developing sort of a basis for this planning. So I think that, just to conclude, so far, foresight planning does not really happen, at least in a systematic way, in my experience, at country level. It may be a challenge at country level, and I think more efforts needed to focus on developing or strengthening generic plans. It's not what countries are doing is not exactly what we're talking about here. The second point I'd really like to make is that while countries might have difficulty or challenges doing this at an individual country level, I think global foresight planning could and should be done at a more regional level. I think it makes sense if blocks of countries do this kind of thinking together, because as Alexander's clearly said, context, cultures, risks, capacities are different in different regions. For instance, countries that use or that have a lot of wet markets should perhaps plan together. Countries where deforestation is occurring should have common risks, and they should be planning together. So I think that taking into consideration different contexts, different regional contexts, I think is important. And scenario building might make more sense if it's done at a regional level. And I'm really talking, when I talk about regions here, I'm talking about sort of climatic, geographic, political regions, and not necessarily sort of WHO regions. But I think that this would be very interesting for countries. I think the third point I'd like to make is that foresight should be about thinking about futures for prevention, but also for mitigation. And perhaps that's part of what's being imagined here. But I would argue that some pandemics are inevitable. And while we may be able to do this kind of thinking to prevent or prepare for preventing some pandemics, some will occur. And I think that we need to really imagine how we can develop scenarios for mitigation. I often think about how this pandemic might have been different had it affected children instead of older adults. How would we have mitigated the different knockoff effects should that have occurred? What are our predictions for what happens to social systems, to economies when pandemic hits? And I think scenario development here is very important. I was thinking of what might be a practical example for this, and certainly certain countries have similar economic vulnerabilities. For instance, these countries might plan together. So, for instance, Thailand and Cabo Verde, as different as these countries are, both experienced a tremendous impact on their economies from damage to the tourism sector. So, could this kind of planning, foresight thinking, scenario building work for mitigation? Could countries sort of get together in blocks depending on their or economic vulnerabilities, and sort of plan out different scenarios and how they might mitigate those scenarios. I think as far as things that did not work well, things that worked well, I really won't go into those. I think you all have some ideas. I think that, if we're going to do foresight planning, strategic planning, scenario building, there are some basic things that we need to fix at country level. I think you're all aware of what those are. It's a cliche to say that we need to build stronger health systems, but I think systems that are more effective at managing outbreaks at local level, contact tracing, case identification, contact tracing, quarantine, isolation, where this was done well. I think countries were able to control the epidemic. Where it wasn't done well, countries had more challenges. I think we need to be building trust in institutions, obviously, and I think we need to be rethinking our approach to public health and social measures as a way to manage future outbreaks. This could be also a part of imagining different scenarios. I think public health and social measures, the kind of social distancing, hand washing, mask wearing, was very difficult to implement in certain contexts, and I think many of you may have experience with that. But I think many people were able to implement these measures both at a personal level and a community level. But obviously, certain communities had significant challenges with these, and I think this needs to be thought of. So these are some of the big issues I think that need to be resolved if we are that need to be taken into consideration as we do this kind of planning going forward. So just to conclude, I think it's a very interesting paradigm. It's new. I don't think it's happening in a systematic way, at least in many countries. I think there's lots of room here for countries to develop the approach. I think it will be challenging in low and middle income countries, perhaps less so if we do it as blocks. I think we should plan together where context and risks are similar. I think it needs to be multi-sectoral for sure. And I think we need to also focus not just on how we might prevent scenarios, prevent science fiction, but mitigate it, because I think that there's only so much we can do to prevent, and I think a lot of our efforts, if we're going to do better next time, have to focus on mitigation. Maybe I'll stop there. I hope that was useful. Back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very, very useful. And I think we've given our audience a lot to think about. We'd really like to hear from you as the audience, whether you've also had any experiences with this foresight methodologies, and what are your thoughts really on how foresight can change the way or improve the way we manage future pandemics. So please don't hesitate to put some questions, some comments and thoughts into the Q&A on Zoom. While our audience thinks about that, I'd like to pick up on one of the points that you made, Daniel, which was really about groups of countries planning together and the value in that. I think I'd like Sylvie's perspective on this, because I think when we talk about preparedness, we often talk about, well, infectious diseases, they don't know any borders, and they you can travel across the world. So the response needs to be much broader than just an individualized national response to infectious threats. So Sylvie, what are your thoughts on when countries plan and prepare together? How will that positively impact the response, particularly in the light of what we've seen with the COVID pandemic, where there've been such individualized responses to the threat? Over to you, Sylvie.
Yes, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Daniel, for your very important contribution to this discussion, because really, as you rightly said, we all have different perspectives, and through dialogue that we can also better understand the other's perspective and work together. So I fully agree with your idea of grouping countries, because in fact, the impact of the pandemic has been very different in different parts of the world, and not only on health, because of course you have some countries who have really have the very high death toll, and others less, fortunately, but it's also a very huge impact on mental health as well, and on economies, and on the society as well. We have seen in certain countries a huge polarization of the debate, and also it has undermined hugely the social cohesiveness as well. So I think this diversity of impact is also very important to analyze, because when we prepare for the next pandemic, of course, we need to prepare for reducing the number of cases, the number of deaths, and we need to make sure that the health system will not collapse. So these are very important points, but we need also to think how can we make sure that the society as a whole will recover from those crises. And in some countries, we already see that this recovery will be very long and will affect other sectors like the economy, but also the mental health of the whole country. So very important, I think, to understand this diversity of impact depending on this context. As you rightly said, Alex, the evolution is happening, but in a certain context, and the context makes a huge difference also in the impact of pandemic. And so grouping countries with the type of impact they would like to prevent, I think, would be a really good approach. For example, as you said, countries with impact on tourism, they might want to find their own solutions for border control, quarantine, cordon sanitaire. They might want to be more innovative in that sense because they need also the tourism industry for their living. And so for them, the impact is enormous. And so they have probably to plan for how to mitigate this impact during the next pandemic. But similarly, I think for example, if we think about school closure, the impact of school closure is enormous in countries where kids cannot have access to virtual classes, online learning. Where really they really depend on the physical school and classroom to learn and for their education in the future. So in those countries, of course, the impact of school closure is enormous and cannot be sustained for many weeks. It has to be short, timely, and useful to reduce the risk, but not extended as we have seen in certain countries. So grouping also countries based on how social and public health measure impact them is important. And we have seen during this pandemic, for instance, that in some Asian countries, they are used to wear a mask. So for them, wearing a mask was not really a change in behavior. I mean, they just probably used it more or in different settings, but it was not a big change in behavior. While in other countries, it was just an enormous cultural shift, and there has been also even demonstration against a mask because it was seen as an attempt to freedom of citizens. So I think the perception of public health and social measures is also very different, and the context in which they are applied is very important to ensure the compliance and the effectiveness of those measures. So similarly, I think we should probably group countries with this kind of same cultural pattern to make sure that they find also ways to implement those measures in a way that it could be more culturally acceptable and also more efficient at the end, because if you have everybody wearing the mask below the nose, it's not very useful. So probably they just don't wear masks and they just wash more their hands because they have access to running water as well. So this is some thinking of what you have said, but I think this is a very good idea and for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sylvie. And actually, one of the questions I think was building on that and said, will such strategic planning be helpful to make a more equitable and collaborative preparation for future disasters? Or is it just for individual countries? How can we make health systems, public health and politics more cohesive through this process? So I think it was also building on those ideas. So Daniel, I don't know if you wanted to make any further comments on that, otherwise we can move on to other questions.
No, I think at country level, I think there's a certain utility to this kind of planning at country level for sure. I think, but the real relevance, the real utility, I think, will be at a broader level. It will be looking at scenarios that take into consideration countries that are interlinked, that share borders, that have common risks, and that must work together to address those risks and address these kind of events. So I think that while I think developing capacity for this kind of work at country level is important, it's going to be much more relevant for the broader contribution, I think.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So I think there's a question maybe for Alex that's come through. Is there any established matrix that helps us to objectively derive a conclusion for a Foresight project? That is, how do we reduce the subjectivity and bias in Foresight? Alex, do you want to take a go at that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a great question, and I understand we didn't go into detail about the approach that we are using, the morphological approach we are using to build the scenarios for this exercise. But I guess we didn't want to spoil a lot of things for the next webinars. But the short answer is that yes, there is, right? For this project, we are using a scenario planning approach. We are using a scenario planning methodology that is called the morphological approach. And if I may share my screen again, which will make things easier, this is what the morphological approach looks like, right? This is what we call the morphological box, and this is what we use to develop the scenarios for this Foresight initiative. And this again goes back to what Daniel just described, right? How this ecosystem of change, which is COVID-19, is so complex and so it really is so multidimensional and multi-sectoral. So what you see on the screen is essentially all these trends that are likely to affect how COVID-19, how the ecosystem of the COVID-19 pandemic will look like in the next 3 to 5 years. And you can see that this box doesn't only include trends and drivers that are very close, let's say, to epidemiology, that only have to do with pathogen and host characteristics, but the box also includes trends and drivers that are likely to affect how countries and how the WHO and how member states are going to respond to the COVID-19 and other future infectious threats. So everything around public health and social measures, but also, and most importantly, I think, it also includes all these contextual factors, all these other things that, in a way, both Sylvie and Daniel mentioned already, right? Cultures, human behaviors, healthcare innovation, and strengthening of healthcare systems, national healthcare systems, climate change impacts, right? All the climatic zones and the climatic regions that Daniel mentioned, how these play their own individual role in how the pandemic will play out in specific regions, in specific countries, conflict and civil unrest. So in a way, there is a matrix. So this is essentially a matrix. I'm really glad that you use that word, whoever it was. But what we essentially do, we take that box, that matrix, and for each key factor, for each trend, under these 3 categories, we start building projections, right? So you can see here at the right-hand side of the screen, if transmissibility is a key driver for the future of the COVID-19 pandemic, under the pathogen host characteristics category, let's say, then there are a number of directions that transmissibility can take, right? In the next 3 to 5 years, we might have increased human transmissibility. We might have increased human transmissibility with sustainable animal viral reservoirs. We might have variable human transmissibility, stable or even reduced. So for each key factor, for each big trend that shapes the future of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we essentially do, we build these mini scenarios, and then we do that for all the key factors, for all these big trends, and we combine these mini scenarios, and we essentially come up we come up with a scenario, which is this process that's happening here with the blue. And just to give you an idea what these mini scenarios look like for its trend or for its key factor, as we call them, here it is, right? And then also this goes back to what Daniel was saying before, that in different countries, in different regions, and in different settings, like a new pandemic risk might look completely different depending on, like where you are in the world, for example. One thing to point out here, one thing to highlight is that this exercise at this point is a very global exercise. And I think it's very important to maintain the global character of this exercise. And then later, to start talking about, like specific interventions and specific strategies and specific actions on a country or a regional level. So Sylvie, I think this is something for us to think about, how we take the scenarios and how we use them, or how we apply them on a more, let's say, specific context, right? And the contexts are variable in this case, because it is such a complicated, such a complex ecosystem. I hope this answered the question. I'm always available to answer more questions offline if you want, but please do stay tuned. I mean, we will be going through all of that in the next webinars. Yeah, I hope I didn't give away too much, Sarah, about what's coming, but
No, not at all. And I think you maybe just gave everybody a teaser for what's to come. So I think my colleague Margot has posted into the chat the links to the website where you can see the actual series explained and what the future topics of this these webinars will contain. So please, join us in the future ones. We have about 8 minutes left in this webinar, so there are a few more questions coming in, and we'd like to get to answer those. The one question is, how does one differentiate between foresight and long-term planning, as the latter also tries to avoid certain scenarios? So methodologically, maybe Alex, you wanted to contribute to that, and then maybe Sylvie and Daniel in the actual reality and operationalization you could add.
Yeah, yes, Sarah, of course, thanks. Well, quick answer is I don't know, to be honest. I mean, in my head, long-term planning is part of foresight, right? I mean, what changes in this case is the time horizon. And again, another thing that I would like to highlight is that the time horizon is important in any sort of foresight or even long-term planning exercise, right? So for this initiative, for the infectious hazards foresight initiative, the timeline we are using is quite short, so 3 to 5 years, right? So when you go further down the line on a timeline and you start looking into how things might play out in the next 5 to 10, 10 to 15, or even 20 to 50 years, then you have a completely different range of trends that are impacting your context. You have a completely different range of drivers that are shaping the shape or they're driving the shape of this ecosystem. So I think one key difference is the kind of trends, is the kind of drivers, is the kind of key factors that are shaping this context, right? So just to give you a more tangible example, in our case, we, for example, climate change impact, climate change as a long evolutionary trend. Has a very different, let's say, expression or manifestation, whether you look at it within the 3 to 5 year time frame, or you look at it to the 10 to 20 year time frame, right? Within 3 to 5 years, you can relatively safely talk about extreme weather events, and but you can't really talk about like more let's say or heavier impacts when it comes, for example, to the 1.5 degree target set by 2050. So I think that is a different, right? The ecosystem of change, how that ecosystem looks like, depends a lot on the time frame, and this might be a difference between foresight and long-term planning, or within foresight, what is short-term planning, medium-term planning, and long-term planning.
Thanks, Alex. Sylvie, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, for me, I think what is really interesting with foresight is that we look at factors that are not necessarily in our area of work or sector. For instance, I'm working in the health sector. I tend really to consider as priority health factors. But with the foresight, it really forces us to think of other type of trends, other things and that are outside our sectors. So I think it helps us to have a broader view and somehow give a planning that is more anchored in the reality rather than just aspirational planning, maybe. And the other thing that is important, in my opinion, is what Alex said earlier on, is that we try to understand the future. And understanding is not only intellectually satisfactory, but it's also, I think, very useful because we know that in all those factors and in this future, there are many things we cannot do and we cannot change necessarily. But at least understanding them helps a lot to also differentiate the thing we can do and the real action that we can have on this future. So for me, foresight is also kind of inspirational, allow us to look at the future with something that is more positive, I would say, like just planning for it. And so that's why I think this initiative is interesting, and we still have a lot to learn from it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sylvie. So we're going to take one more question, and I'm going to direct it to Daniel. And Daniel, if you had any comments on the previous, please feel free to throw them in as well. But we've had a question from Frederick, who says that some countries are using simulation exercises and planning processes to enhance their preparedness capacities. But this is often done ad hoc and not systematically. In addition, we are collectively not really learning, but rather identifying challenges and then making similar mistakes again. So how can we better ensure we truly learn from the past and build capacities for the future response? Big question, Daniel, for you to end on.
And one that I full on agree with. And maybe I'll just take a step back and say that I really like that Alexander's allusion to science fiction. You know, this is, and I like it not because we're talking about fantasy or things that will never happen, but we can imagine, but because this kind of thinking is clearly asking us to imagine things that we may not have imagined yet, or we may not think are possible, but may be possible in the future. I think, you know, that the question is good, because when we do planning, we tend to do planning based on what we've seen. Okay, so this is what happened. We made these mistakes. Now let's plan, and we won't make these mistakes again. And we'll try this and that, or this and that. We'll do this plan to not make these mistakes again. But I think what this is a little bit different. It's looking forward and using our imaginations to think about things that we might not have thought about. And certainly, I see sort of things like tabletop exercises or drills or that kind of very active sort of acting out of the different scenarios that we develop as being really important. But I think they can be used to in the context of more forward thinking rather than sort of reacting to what we've already seen. I kind of see this whole thing as like a game of chess, right? I mean, you're sort of looking there are many different moves. You've got to look 5, 6, 7 moves ahead. The possibilities become more and more complicated as you move forward. But essentially, that's what it is, and essentially that's what we're being asked to do, and it's really what we need to do in the future to mitigate the kind of experiences that we've had. That's what I think.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think we're at time. I guess nothing remains but to say thank you very much to Sylvie, Daniel, and Alex for your presentations and the discussion. Thank you also to all those who joined us today and contributed to this. Again, we'd like to invite you back next week to the subsequent webinars in this series. On these webinars, we will be discussing with a broad range of partners and different voices the global trends that are currently shaping our world and that will have an impact on the emergence, course, and trajectory of this pandemic and future pandemics. So promising to be another exciting discussion. So thank you, everybody, and I do wish you a very safe, healthy day. Take care.
Thank you very